Your presenter, Dr. Ron Honeyhockey.
Three dreaded words that many of us or our family or our friends have had to face. You have cancer. How many in this room have been told this? Yeah. How many in this room have had a spouse, a friend, or a parent? Probably about everyone in the room on that one. Fear, pain, and helplessness. You've tried to tell yourself that it just can't happen to you. You're told you must have a biopsy. Then the terrible waiting comes. Then the three numbing words. Then the fear of awaited pain and loss. And then that overwhelming feeling of helplessness. When we look at the cancer statistics in 1971, Richard Nixon declared war on cancer, and billions of dollars were committed and has since been spent on trying to find the cause for cancer. But between 73 and 92, the cancer death rate rose 6.3% anyway. It is now predicted that 40% of the U.S. population will get cancer sometime in their lifetime, and 25% will die from it. As of this presentation, and it's not like tomorrow there's going to be an announcement to where they're going to say, okay, we've discovered the cause for cancer. There is no scientific consensus on what causes cancer. We have a lot of ideas. People have followed a lot of threads of evidence, but there's no agreement as to what the cause for cancer is. And I'm not going to try to provide a definitive answer to that question as to what causes cancer today. Rather, what this presentation is going to do is to try to provide a compelling, plausible, and scientifically factual hypothesis that can serve as a guide to prevention and treatment for the weary and bewildered health consumer and cancer patient. What do you see up here? When I put this picture up here, what do you see? Just some kind of like dots. And here's a few more. We'll just call them points of fact. And there doesn't really look like much. But if I put in just one more dot, now what does that look like? Yeah, it looks like the Big Dipper. You can start to see a pattern to it. So the goal of the presentation today is to start to connect some dots. I don't know how many of you were here Tuesday for Jack Challen's presentation, but he talked about connecting dots, and I thought that was a really good way of thinking about this. I'm going to be giving you some facts about fungi. And out of those facts, I'm going to let happen in you, I hope, what's happened in me, which is the development of a picture, a plausible picture of how fungal infection may link to cancer. You can't go home and say, hey, I just heard what the cause of cancer is. I know what it is. We don't know this for certain. But I think there's enough information and factual data here that a picture is starting to develop. This picture can be used as a working model of a modifiable diet and lifestyle behaviors that could very well reduce or delay your risk of developing cancer, or if you have cancer, it could help you do a better job of fighting the cancer. Then we'll show how this model can be utilized to create safe, adjunctive cancer treatment protocols. Now here at the center, we have a very special concept called co-learner. And you could think of it as a kind of attitude. It's our name for patients. We refer to our patients out here as co-learners. Now, co-learners get involved in their own care. They don't just sit passively waiting for some doctor or someone to tell them what to do. They get involved. They develop a detective mindset. What we find is that each person is their own unique individual, and it's hard to generalize. And so you have to become almost like a detective and try to figure out, okay, what's unique about me that led for me to have this disease at this time? What are the underlying causes? Our co-learners are not victims of any illness. We begin to see in a very responsible way that certain things have led up to our illness, and that maybe by understanding the illness we can make better choices to help us promote a healing process within our own bodies and lives. Co-learners explore reasonable, safe alternatives. To me, this is the best of what alternative medicine is. There's a lot of stuff in alternative medicine that I don't personally agree with and don't think is very good. But the essence of alternative medicine is the ability to look for alternatives, because very often we paint ourselves into a corner, and this is especially true in the whole realm of cancer. You get that diagnosis, and if you start reading the statistics and they don't look very good, you tend to start thinking, gee, there's just no way out. I feel helpless. And so that's the time when you need to start breaking out of the cocoon of established convention and start looking for other models that will help you understand your illness, understand a model of plausible causation. And the word plausible here is very important. It's a very precise word. Plausible means that we may not have all the data we need for everyone to agree, but we have enough information that it can be utilized in a very constructive way to help you achieve your end of getting well. So co-learners are attempting to look for and treat the underlying causes of their illness rather than just putting a symptomatic Band-Aid on it. So in that light, I would like to make a dedication. I would like to dedicate this presentation to all the cancer patients that I have had the opportunity and honor to serve as a fellow co-learner. And this, to me, is one of the most exciting parts of the co-learner concept. The doctor is a co-learner, too. Now, we've all known that all along, but a lot of doctors don't like to admit that maybe we don't know everything, and we do have a lot to learn ourselves. And when we develop this partnership with our patients, it has an empowering quality that works both ways. It is my sincere hope that as co-learners, we will never stop searching for more effective cancer prevention and cancer treatment models. And that's what this presentation is all about today. It doesn't mean that what I'm going to say today is generally accepted. Probably this is there's probably a very small percentage of doctors in the United States that even knows about the fungal link to cancer. That doesn't mean that this model can't be of use to you right here and today. And those of you that do not have cancer, it can help you prevent cancer. And I want to extend this dedication to two very special cancer survivors who happen to be both named Mary. That is my wife and my mother. Okay, let's jump in here. What is a fungus? The Bantam Medical Dictionary very simply defines a fungus as a plant, a simple plant that lacks chlorophyll. And fungi include yeasts, rusts, molds, mushrooms, just to name a few. But some of the species of fungus infect and can cause diseases in man, and that's what we're going to be interested in, are those particular types of fungus. Now there's 5 fungal features: achlorophyllous, heterotrophic, spore-bearing, eukaryote, and absorptive nutrition. Now I put those there on purpose because they sound very foreign and like, gee, what do those words mean? But I don't want you to be thrown by just the words. I want you to use these words to start to get a picture of how these fungi, how fungal organisms function, how they try to stay alive, where they get their food, what their purpose is. And these details should start to fit together in a logical way to help you understand maybe why people get cancer, or what keeps cancer going, or what makes cancer worse, what makes it better. Remember, even though mycology, which is the study of fungus, is rarely taught, see, they do teach a little bit of mycology in medical school, but not much. Even though it's rarely taught, it's even more poorly understood. But it can be grasped, and that's what we're going to do today, is try to grasp a little bit about mycology, or the study of fungi. But to do this, you're going to have to start connecting the dots, and the dots are these fungal facts. So let's go back to this first characteristic of fungus, achlorophyllous. It's just Latin. It means a plant with no chlorophyll. That's just how I defined what a fungus is. It's a plant with no chlorophyll. Now wait a minute. Plants need chlorophyll in order to use photosynthesis in order to derive energy. So these plants have no chlorophyll, so they must be deriving their energy from some other source. By the way, fungi don't like sunlight. We have a deck on the back of our house. The house sits where the deck is on the north side, and where the sun can't get to the deck, that's where the mold is growing. Have you all noticed that? Where there's plenty of sun, there's no mold. So remember that. That's a nice little key fact, that sunshine and light are places that molds don't like to be. So how do these fungi get their energy? For them to live, they have to get energy from somewhere. Well, this is where we get into the second characteristic of what a fungus is. It's heterotrophic. All that means is that the fungi derive their nourishment from preformed organic matter. Now that can fall into two categories. You have the saprophytic or the saprophytes, and sappho means dead or death. So these are fungi that eat dead or decaying vegetation or tissue. An example would be mushrooms or molds. And one way to think of a fungus, thank God there is fungus, because when leaves fall off the trees and die, if there weren't fungus to take that decaying organic matter and consume it and break it down, the world would pile up with tons and tons of garbage. But thanks to fungus, that's all broken down. Decomposition is what keeps things kind of cleared out. But then there's another type of fungus, and these are the parasitic types of fungi, who live off of living hosts or animals. They reproduce in living plants or living animals, often to the detriment of the host. That's by definition what a parasite is. It's a living thing that lives in you or on you, and it creates problems. An example would be candida yeast, and I'm sure that many of you have thought a lot about candida and how to defeat candida. That's one example of a fungus or a fungal infection. Let's move on to the third characteristic of fungus. All of these are going to be important as we move along in the talk. Spore bearing. Spores are one-celled, self-reproducing units. And you could think of spores as fungal seeds. This is how the fungus reproduces itself and spreads itself around, much as in the same way a tree would produce seeds, or a dandelion produces. That's a real good way. When the dandelion shoots up that little, you have a nice pretty little yellow flower, and that would be like the mycelium of a fungus. But this yeast stage of the fungus is where it actually becomes spore forming, and those are like the little seeds. When you blow on the dandelion and they go floating off, those are like fungal spores. Eukaryote, that's a fancy word, but all it means is that these are cells that have a nuclei or a nucleus of the cell. Well, human cells also have nuclei. The DNA in fungal cells is 98% similar to human DNA. It's amazingly similar. It's a little bit uncanny, actually. The fifth characteristic is that of absorptive nutrition. How do the fungi get their nutrients into their body? They digest the food outside of their bodies by growing on or inside their food source, secreting an enzyme into the food. After the food is digested, then it is absorbed into the fungal cells. And these enzymes that are secreted by the fungus can be harmful to the organism or to the organ tissues. Some people call these enzymes and some of the products of what the fungus makes mycotoxins. And so mycotoxins can be very harmful to the organism that the fungus is living in or on. So it really leads us to ask the question, is the fungus a plant or is it an animal? And it turns out that fungi exhibit characteristics of both. It's like an animal cell in that it has a nucleus, it breathes oxygen, which means it's aerobic, and this is when it's in the mycelial form, kind of like when the dandelion is a little flower. But the fungal part that's like a plant, that can breathe without oxygen. It's anaerobic, and that's when it's in the yeast form of the fungus. So there's two forms that fungi can live within, and they kind of have, one form has animal characteristics and the other form has plant characteristics. Now here's another kind of big word, but you don't need to be scared by it. Fungi are facultative anaerobes. Now, what does that mean? It just means that they can grow with or without oxygen. With or without oxygen. Now, if they're growing with oxygen, that's called aerobic respiration. That's like the joggers. Aerobic exercise is where you're jogging and using oxygen. That's a more efficient way to derive energy from calories. If you're using oxygen, you can get 36 molecules of ATP, which is how your body stores energy, from one molecule of glucose. But it's a much less adaptive form of metabolism. Now, anaerobic respiration, where you don't require oxygen, that's also called fermentative metabolism. It's much less efficient. It only derives 2 molecules of ATP from glucose, but because it does not require oxygen, it's more adaptive. So we see these two types of metabolism, and the fungus can do either one. It can go either way. Now, just as a first little note to kind of show you a parallel between fungal cells and cancer cells, we know that cancer cells are anaerobic and fermentative. Cancer cells do not require oxygen, and they use sugar as their main source of fuel. Now, I'm going to be hitting this point over and over again in the presentation. So how do fungal species survive? Well, they do a very good job of surviving. Fungi are the most populous group of all biological organisms. So we need to have some respect for fungi. They inhabit a large part of the earth. Right now we have identified 69,000 species of fungi, 200 of which are known to cause diseases in man. But mycologists estimate 1.5 million species of fungi have yet to be identified. So then if you take that ratio up above here, 69,200 known, that means that there may be another 17,000 disease-causing fungal species that we have not yet identified that are there potentially causing problems. So that alone makes us think that maybe the fungus is involved in many diseases, and certainly in the disease of cancer. One researcher, Dr. Leo Kripe, went so far as to say we do not live in a world of fungus, but rather we live in the fungus world. Fungus are so predominant in our world, and probably what we've never thought of is that whole species of plants and animals have survived because they've been able to defend themselves against fungi. And our immune systems have fungal defenses built in. So with all this in mind, what good is a fungus? Well, there's a lot of things that fungi do for humans. We get food from mushrooms, and indirectly you can use fungus to make alcoholic drinks such as wine or beer. You wouldn't be able to have bread if you didn't have the fungus, the yeast to raise the dough, and certainly the manufacture of cheese requires fungi. In industry, there's a whole host of fungal products, organic acids, alcohol, antibiotics, various pigments. Your B vitamins that you take are made from fungi, and enzymes that are used industrially and in supplements. These are made from fungi. In medicine, antibiotics are fungal metabolites. The discovery of penicillin. Penicillin came from a mold. It's a fungus derivative. Ephedrine is made from yeast cells. Cyclosporin, which I'll talk about a little bit later, very important medicine for people who have had transplants. That's made from fungus. So there are some good things that fungus does for us, in addition to keeping garbage level of the world down. But there is a dark side. Mycoses, this is the medical term for fungi that cause human diseases. And just to put this in perspective, this is a quote from a textbook. The spectrum of clinical manifestations of mycoses is extraordinarily wide, ranging from the largely harmless discolorations and scalings on the superficial layers of the skin. You know, all of us have had maybe a seborrheic dermatitis or dandruff. That's oftentimes caused by a fungus. Or you've had a little fungus infection of your skin or a little jock itch. That's fungus, or fungus under your toenails. These are, by and large, harmless manifestations of fungus. But you can get hyperphlegmatic, purulent lesions of the mucous membranes, infiltrations and abscesses in the subcutaneous tissue. This is much more harmful fungus. to extensive destruction in the bones, internal organs, the brain, and you can even go so far as mycotic sepsis. In other words, the fungus gets in your blood and completely starts to overwhelm your system. With the exception of the adamantin of teeth, in other words, the hard part of your teeth, with that exception, every tissue or organ of the human body can be infected. And the thing I thought about when I read this statement is that I've never heard of cancer of the teeth. Otherwise, I've heard everything else, every other organ can have a type of cancer in it. And just by virtue of this statement right here, fungus can be involved in every tissue in your body. So we have to have respect for how detrimental fungus can be to humans. Fortunately, we have a very good immune system. If it weren't for our immune systems, then we get into real problems. And if you talk to the doctors who take care of the AIDS patients who have lost their immune systems, a lot of the diseases that they're battling are fungal diseases. So mycology is the study of fungi. Now mycologists, however, only have not only, but they have a PhD compared to oncologists who have an MD. And mycologists, it turns out, study plant and mostly agricultural fungi, whereas oncologists, if they know anything about fungi, it would be mycoses. But unfortunately, most oncologists don't know a lot about fungi. Now, they know more than a lot of doctors because patients who are on chemotherapy, oftentimes their immune systems get knocked down enough to where they get mycotic infections. But anyway, there's a statement that these guys, the oncologists and the mycologists, ought to be having lunch more often together. But they don't. They're in different realms. Mycologists often are in the universities teaching college students, whereas the oncologists are in the medical schools. Well, this statement about them having lunch together comes from not from a doctor. He's actually a medical technician, Mr. Doug Kaufman, and he has written this book that you see pictured up here, and I have a copy of it here, called The Germ That Causes Cancer. It's available at this particular website that I've listed in your handout. By the way, everything that I'm saying is in your handout, so you really don't have to take much notes here. If you want to take what I'm saying today and look at it in much greater detail and follow the line of what's being talked about here today, he's done a very good job in this particular book of detailing all of this. Okay, let's ask the question, how could a fungus cause cancer? Well, we're starting to connect the dots here. Dot number one, there's a lot of fungi out there, as I just mentioned. All of these fungi have to eat. They've got to get a job and make a living too. They will eat dead things or alive things, so they don't care much. And they can act as cellular parasites. And this is the part that we're going to go into detail. Most of us don't think of fungi as parasites. We think of parasites as like, you go and drink some bad water and you end up getting a parasite and it causes diarrhea. Well, this is a different type of parasite. The way you can begin to get a grasp on how fungus could cause cancer is to understand that fungi, when they reproduce, they make these things called spores. They're the reproductive units of a fungus. They're formed by the fungal mycelia. The mycelia is like the plant, if you will, that grows. And when it grows, how many of you have seen what happens when you take a moist piece of bread and put it underneath the sink and let it sit there for a couple days? How many of you all did that when you were in grade school? Yeah, of course, most of us did. Well, those little filaments, those like little hair-like things that grow on the surface of the bread, those are called hyphae, but they are the cotton-appearing mass that's like a bread mold. Well, that's what mycelia are, and these mycelia can reproduce two ways. Sexually, when you get two mycelia connecting up, then you can form spores, or you can have what's called asexual budding, which turns out to be temperature sensitive. So the fungus can reproduce sexually or asexually. So we're understanding now that fungus can exist with oxygen or without oxygen. It can live off of dead or living tissues. It can reproduce sexually or asexually. These fungi are out to survive. They want to survive just like any other living thing, and they've got a lot of different ways to survive. Now I'm going to focus in on one particular type of fungus. This is the Ascomycetes, which means sac fungus, and it's called that because it produces a sac-like container to protect its babies. It's like it forms like an egg or a shell around the container that's very durable. This is one of 69,000 species of fungi, as I mentioned earlier. There's about 2,000 different kinds of Ascomycetes. This is the largest class of true fungi that includes yeast, blue molds, and penicillium. And it turns out that Candida albicans, which probably most of you have heard about, is an Ascomycetes fungus. It's one of this particular type. Now, the majority of fungal diseases are caused by, here's a new word, the conidia of Ascomycetes. So I'm going to spend a little time here defining what a conidia is. It's basically an Ascomycetes spore. So Ascomycetes is the type of fungus, the spore is the way that it reproduces, and then I'm going to show you what happens to these spores. These spores can lie dormant for literally centuries because they're in this sac. You can take the sac, you can boil it, you can freeze it, you can put it in acid. None of these things will destroy the sac. So this fungus wants to survive. It's in the sac waiting for the right conditions before it hatches, so to speak. So the spores remain dormant like a seed. Upon entry into the human host, and this is where it's not real clear, but there's probably a lot of different ways that the spores enter into the human host. They could be in food, they could come through a wound. We don't know all the different ways that they come into the human body, but when this sac that contains the spore gets into a temperature of 98.6, the sac is shed, and now the spore lacks a cell wall. It's just a spore without the sac, and we have a special name for that. We call it the cell wall deficient form. And this form can get through the bloodstream, it can get through the lymphatics, and it can actually penetrate into human cells. This has all been shown. These tiny parasitic yeasts that are the cell wall deficient form of the spore of Ascomycetes, these are what's called conidia. So when I mention conidia, I'm talking about a spore that no longer has a cell membrane or a sac around it. These spores can reproduce asexually by budding inside of human cells. So once they're inside the cells, they can bud, much like a yeast, and make many, many more of themselves. So this is what we call a parasite, and by definition, it's a symbiotic organism that harms or lives at the expense of a host. So these conidia are like intracellular parasites that as long as, it seems like there are some conditions that before they become harmful, but we have been doing studies here at the center under our cancer program called RECNAC, where we can examine the blood cells of anyone. And using a dark field microscopy, we can actually see these L forms, these cell wall deficient forms inside of red blood cells. So this leads us to the question, is cancer a conidial infection? Well, one way to think about this is that fungal diseases happen from outside the body. The spores initially come from outside the body. Endogenous diseases, where the body just suddenly malfunctions for no reason, it's actually very rare. Why would our cells want to malfunction? Usually there's some outside influence that's causing harm to the cells. And that's what this statement says. The cells must experience some outside pathogenic influence before they come ill. So the hypothesis here is that the conidia are what's making cells sick and possibly setting them up for changing into a cancerous type of cell. Scientific American, September 96, said investigators have come to believe that perhaps 15% of the world's cancer deaths can be traced to viruses, bacteria, and parasites. So the question is, what's causing the other 85% of cancer deaths? And this we really don't know. This is the mystery of cancer. We say we don't know what causes all forms of cancer. We certainly have found links between certain viruses and bacteria and parasites, but there's a big chunk of cancer that we don't know why it happens. Yes, cigarette smoking, poor diet, unhealthy conditions, chronic illness, radiation. There are things that certainly do increase a person's risk for cancer, but why do certain people get cancer and other people don't? It's always been amazing to me. I was talking to my mom. I was going to give this lecture, and I said, yeah, I'm going to talk about why some people get cancer and other people don't. She says, yeah, it's the strangest thing. There's a lady in her small town. She was a walker. She always bought good foods. She didn't use a lot of medicine. She did not smoke. And Mom said, strangest thing, she died of lung cancer. And I'm sure all of you have heard of this, where someone doesn't really have the apparent risk factors and yet they end up getting cancer. Why? And so I'm hoping with this presentation today to shed some new light on why even someone who's living an apparently healthy lifestyle can develop cancer. So let's look at how conidial infection can parallel cancer. Well, conidia are capable of causing human disease as a parasitic process. Well, certainly cancer has been described as a kind of parasite within the body. We know that as cancer grows, it's like it doesn't care what the rest of the body needs. It starts to just take care of itself and use up the rest of the body's resources. Conidial cells are able to live quite well inside of a human cell. And what we're finding, this is probably the most controversial thing I'm going to say to you today, is that the active conidia can reproduce a hybrid fungal human DNA which is unrecognized by the immune system. This has been one of the main questions. Why doesn't our immune system recognize cancer cells? And the thinking is that maybe it does in the early stages of cancer. Our immune surveillance system may be able to pick up a cancer in the early stages. But once the cat's out of the bag and you get a certain number of cells growing in a clump, it's like the immune system loses the ability to recognize the cancer, and then it's allowed to grow in a way that the body cannot stop. Okay, this conidia is capable of reproducing by budding. Well, the tumor, in a sense, kind of grows by budding. New cells grow and they invade into local tissue. The conidia can get into the bloodstream and infect other cells. So can the tumor. The tumor can spread by metastasis. So you can start to see how a yeast infection and the growth and spread of a cancer have some definite parallels. So here we are. We're going to start connecting these dots. After 2 decades of research, one man has done more than any other to establish the fungal link to cancer, and that's Dr. Milton White from Detroit, a fellow of the International College of Surgeons and the American Society of Abdominal Surgeons, longtime member of county, state, and national medical societies, published medical articles for 50 years, a very dedicated, very intelligent researcher. He's been here to the center to present to our researchers. And I'm just going to give you a summary of some of the things that he has determined and he has been trying to, for 20 years now, has been trying to get other people to listen to. He believes that cancer is a chronic infectious disease involving an abnormal anaerobe using fermentative respiratory metabolism, resulting in inflammatory change. As you might recall from Jack Challam's presentations Tuesday, people with cancer have a high C-reactive protein. Cancer is an inflammatory process. And it appears to be caused by a germ. The germ, according to Dr. White, is intracellular, invasive, parasitic, asexual, anaerobic, and it has a cell wall deficient spore, and it sure looks like it's the conidia that we've been talking about. This germ accounts for the origin of cancer. You can explain why cancer has started in someone, why it starts to enlarge as a tumor, why it can spread to lymph nodes, and why it can metastasize to distal tissue. The other thing we find is that it needs compatible blood flow, and that we find that here in our research at the center and a number of other researchers around the country find that the tumor secretes some kind of chemical that causes more and more blood cells to grow towards the chemical, or towards the tumor, in order to feed the tumor. And this is what we call angiogenesis. And one of the very exciting cutting edges of cancer research is anti-angiogenesis therapies, which we have one here at the center that we have made available. Okay, now before we say, okay, this must be it, this must be the germ is the problem. The germ is the agent of illness, but that's different than looking at the host, the environment that germ is in. Just to use an illustration here, I would ask the question, does the pneumococcus bacteria cause pneumonia? Well, a lot of people say, well, of course it does. That's how you get pneumococcal pneumonia. But if we did throat cultures on everyone here in the room, we'd find out that many of you have pneumococcus in your throats, but I don't hear anyone coughing. And the reason for that is because you've got to have a host environment. Your immune system has to be down, or your mucus has to be malformed, or something has to happen to where that germ or that agent of disease can take root in your system. So what it needs is a compromised host for the germ to take root, grow and spread, and to cause illness. So it's not just conidia, it's not just fungal spores that cause cancer. This is a very important point. It has to do with the fact that something is happening in people that are compromising their immune systems and making them a more suitable place for the fungus to grow. So if we look at what keeps us from being a good environment for fungus to grow in, well, if we have healthy gut flora, we now know that 80% of the white blood cells circulate in the area of the gut, they kind of orbit in the near vicinity of the gut. So your gut flora are very important in terms of maintaining a good immune system. Fruits and vegetables. This is what the majority of cancer research has shown, is that people who eat more fruits and vegetables have a lower incidence of cancer. Part of that is the nutrients, but the other reason is that fruits and vegetables, they were once alive, and they live in this fungus world, and they have to protect themselves from fungus. And it turns out a lot of what we call phytonutrients are natural antifungal agents. And that's why many of the new antifungal agents turn out to be things like olive leaf extract and grapefruit seed extract and oregano. We're finding out that plants have done a very good job of protecting themselves from fungus. If you talk to Mel or someone here at the center that deals a lot with plants and gardening, that early stage of the seed germinating and growing, if it doesn't have good antifungal defense system, it's going to be overrun by a fungus in the soil. So natural antifungals are a very important way that we protect ourselves from fungus. And by keeping our immune system strong, this is one of our best defenses against fungus. And finally, knowledge. If someone knows about this, and this is the reason I'm giving this talk today, I believe that if you know about this link between fungus and cancer, this knowledge can help you make better choices in your diet, better choices in your supplements, better choices in your lifestyle, better choices all the way around that can help protect yourself from the influence of the fungus, if indeed it truly is a cause of cancer. The profungal environmental elements, see, something is happening in our environment that is making people more prone to fungus, in my opinion, and they're very simple to look at. Antibiotics. In the last 50 years, antibiotics have just exploded into our culture. We use antibiotics very freely. It's not hard at all to call a doctor's office and get put on an antibiotic for a sore throat. I had one lady when I first went into practice, it seemed like she would show up a lot with sore throats, and I'd look at her throat and it wasn't very bad. And she'd say, I'd ask her, well, what do you want? She says, well, can I just get a prescription of penicillin? Well, after about the 10th time, I said, why are you getting all these prescriptions of penicillin? And she said, well, you know, I keep all of them in a jar, and every time I wash my hair, I take a penicillin tablet so that I don't get a cold. Now, that's not the way to use penicillin, but in her mind, that was the way to prevent colds. Well, unfortunately, we have this notion that antibiotics are kind of like a cure-all, and we're not thinking that these antibiotics can change the gut flora. And remember that our gut flora is an important defense mechanism against fungus. Any fungus that we're getting in our food, in our diet, can be somewhat neutralized or largely neutralized by the good, healthy cells in our gut. Those cells can make, the acidophilus can actually make peroxide, which can neutralize fungi and other bacteria and things that shouldn't be coming into the body. Also, the foodborne antibiotics. You know, the chicken industry uses a tremendous amount of tetracycline to get their chickens to grow faster. Penicillin is used very commonly in cows when they start to get sick, penicillin shot. So we're getting antibiotics even if we don't take antibiotics. And that can be changing our gut flora. Refined diet. We have an abundance of sugars and refined flours in our diet, and that's what fungus lives off of. Fungus requires glucose. That's its preferred food source for the fermentative respiration that it uses. Toxins are kind of weakening our systems. We have an abundance of pesticides. We have an abundance of mycotoxins. If we get a fungal overgrowth in our gut, they produce mycotoxins. And people who have battled candida, what they're really battling in most cases is the toxins, the mycotoxins that the candida is making and weakening your immune system with. Stress. No lack of stress in modern society. And when we are under a lot of stress, we trigger cortisol production from our adrenals, and it turns out that excessive cortisol is an immune suppressant. So cortisol and an excess of hormones like estrogen can also have an effect on being pro-fungal. And then finally, ignorance. If you don't know of this connection, you can just take all the antibiotics and eat all the sugar and be ignorant of any kind of toxic effect, and you don't realize that you may be setting yourself up for a more severe fungal infection, which may be setting you up for cancer. Again, this is a fungal link. I can't tell you this is the cause for a person's cancer, but you have to start thinking like a detective and saying, why did I get that cancer? What was it about my diet or my lifestyle that may have led me to this condition? And if you can start to do that, that can very much help you possibly save your life. The fungal link to cancer. This is going to be actually a little bit repetitious. I'm going to go through what I've just said in a little bit more detail. 10 working premises. These premises should be researched. They're not fully proven, but they're premises that kind of explain why the fungus may be an underlying cause of cancer. Working premise number 1, fungi are everywhere and they can cause infection. Kind of a given, obvious given. Premise number 2, intracellular fungal spores, the conidia that have shed their sac, can lay dormant until the host environment becomes ripe. What are the factors in the host environment that may set up the conditions for the conidia to kind of do their nasty stuff? Number 1, temperature, just your body temperature. That allows the Ascomycetes spore to shed its sac and go into the cell. So that's one thing that we really can't control. Acid pH. People who are under stress or who are eating poorly, their blood can become a little bit more towards the acid side. And it's been found that fungus do not grow very well in an alkaline environment. So your fruits and vegetables tend to have a little bit more of an alkalinizing effect. So that's another reason to go for fruits and veggies. Fermentative food supply. If there's a lot of sugar around, that's something that the yeast can use to grow with. Low oxygen concentration. As we get older, our ability to maintain good cellular oxygen levels lessens. If you don't get enough exercise, exercise is a way to get better oxygen concentrations to your tissues. Immune dysfunction. Certainly, there's a number of factors: stress, poor sleep, poor diet. A number of things can weaken your immune system. Poor bowel flora, as I mentioned earlier. Nutrient deficiency triggers. Dr. Riordan, when I was discussing this with him, he's studied the slime mold, and he says if you take a slime mold and take the growth medium and take all the niacin out of it, the slime mold will very quickly go into the spore-forming stage. In other words, when there's a lack of certain nutrients, it's like the fungi become more aggressive. They're going to try to search for food sources. And then toxic overload. If you get an overload of toxins in your body, just your ability to handle all the toxic factors, mycotoxins, pesticide residues, chemical pollutants, cigarette smoke, there's just a number of toxic factors that tend to weigh the body's adaptive mechanisms down. So these are things that could, in an individual, come together and create a kind of threshold at which point they can no longer protect themselves from the conidia that have been dormant in their cells for a long time. Okay, working premise number 3. Fungal spores are not identified in the tumors with routine microscopic techniques. Many of you might be thinking, okay, if there really were these spores inside of cells, why haven't the medical profession just jumped on that and made a big deal of it? Well, the problem is when you do a microscopic stain, you're actually staining the cell wall. Well, remember that the conidia has jettisoned its cell wall. It's a cell wall deficient organism. Now, there are special stains that you can use to identify the conidia. And there's a Dr. Matson who has a book in our library, Cell Wall Deficient Forms, where she has done a lot of research, a lot of very good academic research showing that these can be identified. Unfortunately, they are not identified at the time of surgical biopsies. But by the time they're taken out of the body, these spores can actually disintegrate because they can live in the cell, but if the cell starts to die, the spores cannot survive. So anyway, a lot of doctors are unaware that these exist inside of cells. Working premise number 4. This is the most intriguing one and maybe the hardest one to accept, but fungal DNA can incorporate with its host's DNA. About 2 years ago, on my way to Connecticut to visit my wife's sister and her family, I got a Scientific American, which I didn't keep, but it was a big part of the Scientific American was looking at parasites and how parasites can get into another organism, a host organism, and start to control the behavior of this host organism. And it almost sounds like sci-fi, the invasion of the body snatchers type stuff. But yet, we're finding out that it can happen, and it does happen. And the reason this happens is that the parasite wants to circumvent the host's immune defenses. And the way it does that is that it somehow knocks out the radar so that the self can no longer recognize that the foreign cell is in the body. And it turns out that fungi have been described as the most mutagenic organisms on Earth. They can actually change the DNA. When the Canidia gains access to the nuclei of the human cell, they begin to propagate a hybrid DNA that promotes an anaerobic fermentative metabolism. And this is a picture, an artist's conception of how this would actually work. And what you're seeing is you can't see the writing, but this is the human DNA, and this would be the fungal DNA. And there's a kind of an intermixing that occurs, and you get a hybrid DNA that is now the dominant force in the cell. And this would explain why cancer cells seem to be functioning autonomously. They do not function, they don't care what else is going on in the body. Their only concern is their own self-survival. So this is the hybrid DNA part of this theory. Working premise number 5, the hybrid cell metabolizes using inefficient glucose metabolism. How many of you have known a cancer patient that really all they want to eat is sweet things? They crave sweet foods. And it may be the effect of this hybridization occurring where the body wants more glucose in order to feed the cells. Okay, cancers thrive on sugar, as do fungi. We know that cancer cells prefer glucose. And if any of you doubt that, when you go to have a PET scan, if you think you might have cancer and the doctor sends you to have a PET scan, what they give you is a radioactive tagged glucose. And what they're looking for is a concentration of the glucose in a tumor, because that tumor likes glucose. Cancer patients, by shunning high carbohydrate foods, may starve the growing tumor. And as an example of this, there was a case study where they had 2 children with advanced stage malignant astrocytoma brain tumors, and they were having some seizure activity. And one of the non-medicine ways of treating seizures is to go on a ketogenic diet. I don't know how many of you have heard of the ketogenic diet, but it's a way of reducing seizures. And what the ketogenic diet is it's like an extreme Atkins diet. It's very, very low carbohydrate, high protein, and high beneficial fats. In other words, there's almost no carbohydrate in this diet. Surprisingly, there was a complete cessation of the progression of the astrocytomas and clinical improvements in the kids' moods and learning curve markers. And this was like a year out from their diagnosis. And normally astrocytomas can be very aggressive tumors. The diet worked because it starved the tumor of glucose, cancers and fungi's preferred fuel source. Okay, working premise number 7, the pH of the tumor is acidic, which is secondary to its fermentative metabolism. If it's got this type of a metabolism, it's going to put out more acid. So patients who have cancer tend to have a more acidic environment. Fungal spores can live in that acidic environment. They do not multiply, however, in an alkaline environment. Working premise number 8, the blood supply of the host furnishes the tumor with its nourishment. This is what I talked about in terms of angiogenesis. The tumor actually secretes chemicals which direct new blood vessel growth towards the tumor. And there are some very good anti-angiogenesis cancer therapies on the horizon. This is one I'm not going to go into a lot, but Canidia have an electronegative acceptor that may play a role in the relation of cancer to radiation and forms the basis of the hybrid cell's anaerobic metabolism. This may explain why cancer cells, at least in the early stages, are pretty sensitive to radiation. That's why radiation became a kind of a part of the modern armamentarium to treat cancer, chemotherapy and radiation, because cancer cells, at least in the early stages, are pretty responsive to radiation. Unfortunately, the flip side of that, because these conidia may be activated by radiation, like EMF waves, electromagnetic frequencies, cell phones, power lines, there's always been a discussion about whether or not these sort of things help to promote or trigger the development of cancer. We don't know this for sure. There's conflicting evidence in this area, but it kind of ties in with this whole concept of the fungal link to cancer. Final working premise is that in the late stage cancer patient, the fungal life cycle is complete, and it will begin again through the process of decomposition, which is kind of a gruesome fact, but this is the life of a fungus. Now, the most important part to me of this lecture is not what I've just told you, even though I wanted to provide you some evidence for how fungus does link to cancer. I think now where we want to go is, what can you do to help reduce your risk of cancer? And it turns out that diet and lifestyle can have a big impact on your chances of developing cancer once you kind of use this knowledge of how fungus may play a role here. Now, the American Cancer Society for 30 years said that food has no relationship to cancer. Well, of course, they have changed that position based upon the fact that extensive research has shown that cancer-preventing benefits of fruits and vegetables. However, you would think that with that knowledge that people would be eating more fruits and vegetables. Unfortunately, that's not true. Only 9 to 32% of Americans eat the prescribed 5 fruits and veggies each day. So if you learn nothing else today, it behooves you to eat at least 5, and the color code book says if you want optimal health, you should shoot for 9 to 10 colorful fruits and vegetables per day in order to get those protective antifungal phytonutrients. JAMA even went so far as to say it should now be apparent that there are good foods, bad foods, and downright dangerous cancer-causing foods within every American's diet. What would be the dangerous cancer-causing foods? Well, I'm saying here eat the 5 fruits and veggies per day, and I already mentioned that, the natural antifungal nutrients. But also, you want to reduce the mycotoxin load in your diet. And it turns out that whole grains are pretty good, but grains are a great place for molds to grow. And if you use organic grains where they have not used any preservatives, that's an even better place for molds to grow. So you should be suspicious about grains if you have a risk for cancer or if you have cancer. Mycotoxins are not broken down by cooking. And grains itself, when it gets into your gut, it can break down into sugar. Peanuts are also a good source of aflatoxin, which is a mycotoxin. And so peanuts should be on your suspicion list if you've got a cancer risk. Mycotoxins are what fungi make as a byproduct of their metabolism. And antibiotics are mycotoxins. Penicillin is a mycotoxin, and it works by killing bacteria. Unfortunately, if you take penicillin, it can kill the bacteria in your gut. Cyclosporin, as I mentioned earlier, is made from fungi, and this is what doctors use for patients that have renal transplants or heart or liver transplants, because cyclosporin suppresses the immune system. So if you're eating a lot of foods that are rich in mycotoxins, that have a lot of moldy stuff in them, you may be suppressing your own immune system. You want to favor organic meats that are free of antibiotics and pesticide residues. The organic level does not guarantee low cancer risk, so organics is not, you have to kind of be thoughtful in terms of your use of organic. Organic grains may be more likely to harbor molds and mycotoxins due to the avoidance of mold pesticides and improper storage techniques. So think about that. Recommendation number 4, starve the fungi. Anaerobic disease-causing fungi are fermentative obligates, which means they have to live on sugar. And starch is nothing other than chains of sugar. And starch is broken down in the gut. And I was surprised to find if you follow the old food pyramid, 7 to 9 or 9 to 11 servings of grain per day, that breaks down into 2 cups of sugar before it can be absorbed. And so a high-grain diet may not be a good idea if you've got cancer or if you've got a risk for cancer. Psyllium husks. It turns out that good old psyllium husks, which are from psyllium seeds, they promote better bowel function so that you can eliminate toxins, but also they bind fungal mycotoxins and carry them out of the body. So any mycotoxins that might be in your food. If you're taking some psyllium along with your food, that may help you bind those mycotoxins. You may actually want to try to kill the fungus, and it turns out that there are two major classes of antifungals. There's the natural antifungals and the prescriptive antifungals. You can go to your doctor, and there have been cases where people have used prescription antifungals to help them reduce their fungal load, like diflucan, nystatin, nizoral, sporanox, lamisil, griseofulvin, and amphotericin B are all antifungal agents that can be used. You may not want to use it in the early stages of cancer, though then again, I don't know. This is where I think a lot of research is needed, because these drugs may play a role in cancer treatment. Then the natural antifungals are what we talked about earlier, like garlic, olive leaf extract, vitamin C, which I'm going to talk about a little bit more here, pau d'arco, caprylic acid, grapefruit seed extract. Carrots turn out to have natural antifungals, tea tree oil. There's a long list of antifungal agents that you can start to utilize, and a lot of it has to do with herbs and spices. So getting more herbs and spices in your diet may actually have a cancer-protecting effect. The nizoral story is interesting. There are a number of urologists that are recommending nizoral for prostate cancer patients. They found that it can dramatically lower PSA levels, though they don't know why. Well, now, based upon this model of cancer causation, it may be that by killing fungi, you may be reducing the cancer load in the prostate. The final recommendation is to think in terms of your own personal profungal environmental factors. Try to reduce those and encourage your antifungal environmental factors. The profungal environmental factors, I would not recommend you do antibiotics unless you absolutely have to. Really be careful about what you eat. The diet that Jack Challam talked about Tuesday in terms of the anti-inflammatory diet and the Syndrome X diet also turns out to be a very good anti-cancer diet. Keep your toxin load low, try to manage your stress, and educate yourself. Educate yourself. Healthy gut flora, fruits and vegetables, natural antifungals, strong immune function, and knowledge. These are, I think, your best defenses. And if you have cancer, you can use this information to increase your chances of beating the disease. This is just a little slide I wanted to throw in here. Where do fungi grow? Do they grow on the sunny or the shaded side of the tree? If you have bread sitting on the table, or if you put it under the sink, which ones are you going to grow fungi on? And where are you more likely to get fungus, in the fingernails or the toenails? Yeah, and your toenails are in the dark spot. And just based upon that, who do you think is more likely to get cancer? Someone who's got adequate vitamin D or inadequate vitamin D? Remember that vitamin D is the sunshine vitamin. It's interesting that a couple studies now have shown that vitamin D protects against colon cancer, breast cancer, lung cancer, and prostate cancer. Here at the center, what we have used for almost the last 20 years is intravenous vitamin C. And by working with the fungal link to cancer, it's kind of given me some new insights as to why intravenous vitamin C works. Let me just kind of go through this real quickly with you. I'm almost done. This here is is two molecules, one next to the other. This is glucose, and this is vitamin C. Do you notice how similar they are? And remember I said that fungal cells and cancer cells like glucose? Well, when we give our patients large doses of vitamin C, the cancer cells just gulp this up. They really like it. Now, in our research, what we did is that we took over 800 different cell lines, cancer cell lines, in petri dishes, and we used different concentrations of vitamin C. And we found that at a certain threshold dose, didn't matter what type of cancer it was, vitamin C would kill those cancer cells. The cells mistake vitamin C for glucose. Because they're fermentative in their metabolism, they crave glucose, and so since vitamin C looks so much like glucose, they'll take up the vitamin C in large amounts. And what cancer cells and fungal cells don't know is that a certain small percentage of vitamin C gets converted to peroxide. And so when you build up enough vitamin C inside of a cancer cell, the peroxide will use up its catalase and its glutathione, and eventually the peroxide will kill the cancer cell from the inside out. So this is a type of what I call intracellular chemotherapy. It's where your body is producing peroxide from vitamin C, using up the intracellular reserves of the antioxidants in the cancer cells, and eventually resulting in the death of the cancer cells. Healthy cells have adequate amounts of catalase and glutathione, and besides, they don't crave the vitamin C like the cancer cells do, and so they don't build the real high concentrations. The beauty of vitamin C as a chemotherapeutic agent is that it's good for your good cells. It's a detoxifier. It's an immune builder. People, after they have their vitamin C treatments, they tend to feel much better. Ralph isn't here today, is he? Okay, I have a minister who was going to come today, and I guess he didn't show up. He is about the 4th or 5th renal cell patient that we've had, renal cell carcinoma. And about a year and a half ago, he was diagnosed, and they removed a football-sized tumor from, actually had to take out the whole kidney. But then in the area that they removed the kidney, about 6 months later, it started to recur. And what the doctor told him is he said, "I have never had a patient with this diagnosis survive more than 6 months." Well, that was about a year ago, and we've been doing 50-gram IVCs on this patient for twice a week during this past year. And the tumor, which was starting to grow, leveled off, and this last CAT scan, he told me that it had completely stopped growing. So he has been able to use the vitamin C, and I won't tell you that that's all he's doing. He's very much doing a lot of the things that he's changed his diet. He has he's using a number of antifungal, natural antioxidants and phytonutrients, and so he drinks green tea all the time. So he's doing a lot for himself, but he is convinced we're going to beat this because he has a model that we're using that conventional medicine just doesn't have. Conventional medicine would say, "Hey, this is what's going to happen to you." So in conclusion, is there a fungal link to cancer? Well, I'm going to let you be your own, you can decide that for yourselves. I think there's a plausible model that can help us understand the behavior of cancer, and with that understanding, we can develop reasonable prevention strategies and new and possibly more effective cancer treatments. And to me, it offers hope to many who might otherwise feel hopeless. So again, we want to connect the dots. It may just lead you to true north. Thank you very much.